My name is Polly Reynolds. I'm the head of Adult Services and Archives at the Hudson Library and Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's live virtual event with author David Murray. Before we begin, just a few quick things. Our author series continues next week with historian John Ferling, author of Winning Independence, The Decisive Years of the Revolutionary War, 1778 to 1781. You can register and view a list of all of our programs at hudsonlibrary.org. David's book, An Effort to Understand, is available for purchase from Hudson's independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. We will put a link in the chat for purchase information. You can just follow that and go right to the Learned Owl website. And then, as always, we always encourage questions. I know the author tonight would love to hear from all of you. He is returning to his roots. He's actually from Hudson, Ohio, grew up in Hudson, Ohio. So please enter your questions into that chat, into that Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And if we have time, we will get to those questions. We'd love to hear from you. It's my privilege to introduce tonight's guest, David Murray. David heads the Global Professional Speechwriters Association and comments daily on communication issues on his popular blog, Writing Boots. He's an award-winning journalist and is editor and publisher of Vital Speeches of the Day, one of the world's longest continuously published magazines. He's the author of Raised by Madmen, a memoir about his advertising parents, and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Tell My Sons, A Father's Last Letters. The son of two writers, Murray grew up in Hudson, Ohio, and studied English at Kent State University before moving to Chicago to make his own writing life. Please welcome, or should I say welcome back, David Murray.
Thank you so much, Polly. I've told you, but I haven't told everybody else that, I've been on public radio and on some pretty big podcasts in the course of promoting this book, but this book talk definitely is the one that gives me the most feelings and the most sense of anticipation. I guess those feelings would be mostly pride for just having been recognized by my hometown and this incredibly powerful book talk platform. I'm so proud that Hudson Public Library does such a great job with these and gets so many good people. Also a little fear, I have to say. There may be some people on this call who haven't heard my voice since my inner child was my outer child. That gives me a little bit of pause. There may be people on this call who heard me when I was my inner child, when it was just a child. And there may be people that I hurt when I was a jerky child. So if I seem a little nervous, that's why. It's pretty intense, honestly, to be here with you. But mostly I'm kind of amazed to really have a chance to share some of the ideas that I've come to in this 35 or so years since I've been gone, since I left Hudson, moved to Chicago, and eventually saw a lot of the world. And it really reminds me of a time when I was a kid. I think one of the people on this call is Rich Newza. He's my buddy when I was in Hudson. And in 8th grade, we went on a trip with a teacher. He took a bunch of us kids on like, I don't know why he did this. Did he have nothing else to do? But he took two vanfuls of kids out west on this 2 or 3 week camping trip. We ended up out in Wyoming and back, and it was wild and crazy, and we got in trouble, and it was just kind of a wild and woolly trip. But I remember coming back, and I actually had stories to tell my parents. Like when you're little, you don't have anything to tell your parents because they know everything about you. But boy, we'd been somewhere and we'd been back, and there was actual stories to tell. I had a journal that I think I shared with my mom, and I actually had stories to tell. And that's kind of how I feel like with you tonight, that I've been away for a long time and I have some stories to tell, and I'd love to hear from you as well. So I'd like to sort of, I also want to say that I'm really glad to be doing this at the Hudson Library and Historical Society and with the Learned Owl. These are the places where I learned to read and learn to love books. And I have a seriously love-hate relationship with the library. My mother, I'll go with the hate part first. My mother, when I was probably 11 or 10, my mother had this friend named Peggy Gordon, and Peggy Gordon was an artist, and she decided that she wanted to create that the Hudson kids were playing too much sports and not doing enough art. So she created this art camp for a week. And it was the first week of summer. And like when I was 10 and my little sister was 7 or something. And so all of our friends were outside playing wiffle ball or whatever they were doing. And we were at art camp, which as I remember, it was in the basement of the Hudson Public Library, or at least it felt like it was in the basement. And we were like learning how to play the recorder. And we put up with this for about 2 days. And then we went to my mom and just said, we're not going back. Like we're not going back to art camp. And she had to tell her friend Peggy that her kids were not going to put up with art camp in the Hudson Public Library the first week of summer. So that was my feeling about the library at first. But then something happened to me when I was in 5th grade in Hudson. I was a little kid. I was pretty small, and I kind of got bullied a lot in like 5th and 6th grade. And my parents weren't into sports. And back then, if your parents weren't into sports, you didn't play Little League. Like it wasn't just ubiquitous. And not all parents were into sports. We were kind of a music family. But around 5th or 6th grade, I discovered sports. I discovered football. I discovered all the sports. And I just thought, and I was pretty fast. And I just thought, oh, this is fun. This will be my thing. And I just absolutely went hog wild into it. Partly probably to escape these bullies around the school. But like I would ride my bike about a mile down Aurora Road to the library where it was when I was at Aurora, and I would go in there and I would just read. I read between 5th and 6th grade. I would just go there and sit there and take every book out in the whole sports section down, and I learned everything about football, basketball, baseball, the history of all these things. I think I learned more in those 2 years than I have in the rest of my life combined. I went from zero to sports guy during that time at the library, sitting there reading the books. So that was a magic time. And I think that was a time where it was one of those times where you were reading and you go, oh, books aren't something that I have to do for school. This is like my thing. And you want your kids to feel that way about books. And so I have really intense memories, and it's really cool to be associated with the library. So I'd like to give you a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit and then I'm going to read a little bit. I'd like to read you what I call the title track of my book, An Effort to Understand. Where did I get this title? As Polly said, I run the Professional Speechwriters Association. I travel all around the world talking to speechwriters. One of the most important speeches in the 20th century for speechwriters is this impromptu speech that was given by Robert Kennedy the night that Martin Luther King was killed in April 4th, 1968. Kennedy was running for president, and he was at a campaign stop in Muncie, Indiana. As he was getting on the plane to go to a campaign stop in inner city Indianapolis, he was told that Martin Luther King had been shot in Memphis. And he got on the plane, no cell phones, obviously. He gets off the plane in Indianapolis, and they tell him that King has died from his wounds, and that, the campaign speech that he's going to give in this all-black neighborhood in Indianapolis is obviously off. The police say they won't give him an escort, and he says, "What do you mean it's off? I have to talk to these people. I have to say something. I have to go in." And so the police refused to give him an escort. His campaign staff was freaking out, but he insisted on going in anyway. And this was the scene that ensued, and that became kind of the title of my book. Do they know about Martin Luther King? You can hear Senator Robert F. Kennedy ask someone this as he stands on the back of a flatbed truck in the early spring dark on a street corner in a park in an all-black neighborhood in North Indianapolis. You can just make out the answer of a white official. "We have left it up to you." Kennedy hesitates for exactly 2 seconds, then makes a request that must have come to members of the ebullient crowd as the first signal that this was not going to be a typical campaign rally. "Could you lower those signs, please?" Another 2 seconds. I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. The whole crowd screams at once, then grows quiet just as quickly, which might have surprised Kennedy. He waits 9 seconds before beginning again. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. That was April 4th, 1968, about a year before I was born. Hundreds of times I've listened to the speech that Kennedy went on to deliver that night. I've shown it to audiences of writers all over the United States and all over the world. And every year it seems to me yet less a relic of America's past and more a haunting prediction of America's future. The speech is only 5 minutes long and 543 words. When you hear a speech that short, that many times over a period of time, different words begin to get under your skin and start to itch. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks, whites amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and to replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. That phrase, an effort to understand. A little later, he repeats it again. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand. It sounds so bland, so obvious, so preachy, so white. So why did he say it 3 times to an all-black crowd reeling in shock and despair? And why did they listen? So that was kind of the question that began the book for me, and the book is basically an exploration of how we need to talk to one another and how we need to try ourselves to make an effort to understand one another better in this country and in this society. So I've been on a long journey, as you can tell, but this reading really made me think about my Hudson childhood and how that formed the point of view that I took when I went out into the world. And of course, my Hudson childhood was mostly formed by my parents, who were both writers. And they were both very different kinds of writers. And I'd like to read this little passage to give you a sense of who they were and how they thought, and kind of how I grew up. I was raised to be a communicator. My parents were both writers by trade. My mother, an advertising copywriter and literary novelist. My father, an advertising creative director and an essayist. Even with the commercials they made, they wanted to reach across the divides, racial and generational, of their time. My mother wrote a newspaper ad in 1964. "If you feel sure civil rights is moving fast enough," began the headline over a grainy black and white photograph of a racially ambiguous child in a crib, "try to imagine your children waking up Negro tomorrow morning." A few years later, my father articulated his communication philosophy in a memo whose terms are as dated as its title, "The Man Inside the Man," but whose message holds. He wrote, "All of us as human beings wear a protective cover or a kind of year-round Halloween mask to keep our nerve endings hidden, to keep our soft underside of hopes and needs and hang-ups, our fear, our pride and prejudices, our irrationalities and our cry buttons from hanging out there in the sunlight for someone to push in or puncture. And it's this paper-thin shell that confuses a lot of people in advertising. It's this shell when it comes in big sunglasses or long hair and frightens a lot of us over 30. Or worse, fools us into thinking that it's not just a shell at all, but a whole new and different kind of person in there. And if we hear the shell express some new idea or value, or speak or sing in some strange new language, we strain to hear what was said and try to play back our communication in the same way with the same words. We try, in other words, to communicate with the shell, instead of the he or she inside. He continued, I can assure you from personal experience that today's young people, however sober, serious, callous, arrogant, flip, or freaked out they might appear on the surface, still cry quietly in the bathroom when a pimple appears at prom time, or when they feel unloved or unsure, which they really do most of the time, or threatened or confused by some of the problems that confront them. I believe that honor and justice and truth and logic mean as much to them as to you and me, maybe more. I believe that beneath the shell, they are simply young people, and it's important to pause between those two words, young and people, to fully grasp what they mean, who, in the main, respond logically to logic, lovingly to love, and honestly to truth. My parents were hardly saints, and they could use their words to say cutting and dismissive things, but generally, growing up in their house, the orientation emphasized the importance of grasping the other person's perspective. And that is really very much what my book is about. Some of the book is about politics, and a lot of the promotional stuff around the book, really to make it timely, makes it seem like it's really about politics, as if it's about sitting down with people on the other side of the aisle and having long conversations and convincing everybody to agree with one another. Actually, not much of the book is about politics. There is some of it, but not that much. And one of the reasons that is that I felt pretty unprepared for politics by Hudson. First of all, Hudson was a pretty politically homogenous town. It was said that all the liberals in Hudson could fit in the phone booth at Saywell's drugstore. And of course, that was my mother and probably her friend Peggy Gordon. It was a fairly Republican town, but more than that, it just seemed like more of an apolitical town to me. There just wasn't a lot of talk of politics. I don't remember it being on people's lips very much. And it was also a fairly apolitical time, I think, in history. So I wanna read something to see if this resonates with you about if you grew up around the time I did in the 70s about politics. Because of course we now exist in a world where politics is everywhere. Politics has never been my best subject, probably because I did not grow up in a home where politics was frequently discussed. My father was a bland conservative and my mother was an ardent liberal. He preferred not to discuss politics at all, and he preferred other people who felt the same way. She was more politically minded, but aside from the occasional exasperated outburst, "You voted for Jerry fucking Ford?" She was resigned to canceling out my father's vote in every election and saving her influence for issues closer to home. As for myself, I don't think I knew whether I was a Democrat or a Republican until I graduated from college and moved to Chicago, where Republicans are not allowed. Many Americans, it seems to me, most Americans probably, used to feel pretty disconnected from politics. When I was young, we knew some odd folks who were super well versed in the goings on in Washington, D.C. That is, they knew how to find C-SPAN on the remote. We playfully called them political junkies, and they bashfully called themselves political nerds. They were hobbyists of a kind, sort of like ham radio operators or stamp collectors. These days, all Americans are political junkies, and perhaps not coincidentally, ham radio and stamp collecting are way down. But while we're all political junkies, we're not political scientists, really. We're more like political gossips. So that's kind of how it felt, growing up in Hudson. The other thing about Hudson was that it was super white. There was only one African American in my high school class. We had all that Underground Railroad history and John Brown's time living there, but there were more plaques about that than there were blacks in Hudson when I lived there. Anyway, I recently ran across a journal entry that my mother wrote in a literary journal where she said she wanted to move out of Hudson at one point because, as quote, the only blacks my kids see here are on television. My experience at Kent State, where I went to college, did not acquaint me with a very diverse population either. So I had a lot to experience about a lot of different kinds of people when I moved to Chicago after college, and I did. But I did it from the perspective of a Hudson kid. And though I learned I learned that there were many other legitimate persuasions out there and perspectives, and there were. I never really forgot my view from Hudson, which really helped me understand some things, I think, that my liberal Chicago friends really couldn't. Hudson was one of the most affluent towns also in the region. So Hudsonites, if anyone in the region would have been called, in a term that wasn't really popular then, but is now, privileged, right? So in the book, kind of from that perspective, I argue that word should be less popular in the language. Whether you agree with this view or not, I think you'll see that how growing up in Hudson sort of helped bring me to this view about privilege and helped me understand this point of view. Okay. No person should ever call another person privileged. At least not if the person is truly trying to communicate. Why? Because no matter how advantaged a person may be, thanks to his or her social class, race, gender, physique, nation of origin, region of origin, city of origin, neighborhood of origin, or block of origin, no one ever feels privileged. That's because even the most privileged person had an alcoholic mother and teenage acne, and now has adult psoriasis, a permanent case of imposter syndrome, panic attacks, weight issues, relationship issues, gambling issues, or all of the above. And on a day-to-day basis, everyone, even the most fortunate of us, feels that he or she has fought like a dog to get to cocktail hour, has climbed out of a warm bed in the cold dark, beaten traffic, tolerated crazy coworkers, sated bottomless customers, and slogged through yet more traffic home while on the phone with a narcissistic relative, only to be told upon walking in the back door that the fucking dishwasher is leaking badly. At what point in that day is that person open, even if it's a white male Yale grad and the traffic jam is 3 more Learjets ahead of him on the corporate strip and his crazy coworkers are Mark Zuckerberg and the dishwasher is on his yacht? At what point is that person open to being called privileged? Privileged is a term for the academy. It's for general discussion. When it comes to personal conversation, it's purely a fighting word. If you're trying to communicate with live people, you're better off criticizing them for something they can do something about. And check your privilege doesn't count as something a person can actually do, because if that were actually possible, privilege wouldn't be such a big deal. Let us be clear. There is white privilege. There is male privilege. There is class privilege. But it's a sociological term, not a psychological one. It's for essays, not for communication with a real live person. It's true, just not inside you. And so how did I learn that in Hudson? If it's true, I learned it because I surely did not feel like I had it made growing up in Hudson. As I said, I was bullied in junior high. I went off to drug treatment when I was in high school. I had a few friends, but I had at least as many enemies, and I considered all enemies were people I feared because they were more popular than I was, and they seemed more confident than I was. And I always thought that just like everybody seemed popular except me and a few other people. But I looked at my high school yearbook recently. Do that sometime. It's shocking how many of those faces that are staring back at you looking completely lost. Those eyes look completely lost, as do mine. And I think we were all completely lost. And I do thank God there were so many good teachers at Hudson High School. My daughter goes to one of the best high schools in Chicago. She hasn't had more than 1 or 2 great teachers in her time in junior high or in middle school or high school. We had a lot of great teachers at that high school. and they seem to gravitate to Hudson. One of them, Mrs. Greer, my freshman high school English teacher, I think is on this call with us tonight. She taught me To Kill a Mockingbird. She taught me how to diagram sentences, which I loved because it made me feel like I was doing math, and I could actually do it. And she suggested in a really casual way that I could be a writer one day, which was the first person other than my writer parents who made such a suggestion. And so I got in touch with her when this book came out. And when I told her how much of her classroom I remember, right down to the posters that she had on the wall, she wrote to me, "Your memories remind me of how our kids are half asleep and half on fire, how we need to help them wake up gently and at the same time protect them from scorching." That's a wise teacher right there. And there were a lot of those in Hudson. But of course, the two Hudsonites that taught me the most were my parents. My dad lived to the ripe old age of 85, moved out of Hudson many years before he died at 85. But my mother died in Hudson on the night before Thanksgiving, 1990, when I was a junior at Kent State. She had a number of health problems, but it was a real shock when that happened. And like everything else that's happened to me, it made me be a better communicator. It helped me understand other people a little bit better. So I wrote this kind of a poem for a friend whose daughter had died, but this was based on my mother, the experience I had when my mother died. What do I know about grief? I know what everyone knows about it, and I've had a chance to see it lately at close range and with sufficient remove. Grief should be called sadness-induced insanity. When you're grieving, every decision you make, you'll second guess later, muttering, "What in the world was I thinking?" You will walk into a convenience store with a porcelain coffee cup in your hand. You will nearly get hit by cars because your world has been so spectacularly destroyed that you can't believe everyone in Chicago doesn't know how to stay out of your way. They didn't know the Hindenburg exploded? Have they been living under a rock? Grief might also be called wisdom. It's in grief that some acquaintances become your friends and some friends become your family because you have been too distracted to sort those things out as you went along. My college roommate became my best friend one afternoon in the basement of our house shortly after my mother died by shooting 50 games of pool with me and asking me 100 questions about what it feels like to have your mother die. That very same week, it must have been, my girlfriend's mother became a mother of mine, and my mother-in-law eventually, by filling her wine glass all the way up, leaning back and asking me, "So, tell me about your mother." That was a good week. Grief might also be called God. Grief demands truth from those suffering through it and from those hoping to help. It exposes their egos and their lies, white and otherwise. Grief reveals everyone's limits, including those of the dead, and in doing so gives everyone one perfect shining chance to forgive everyone for everything. Everyone should take it. Grief reduces politicians and other celebrities to their properly plain status as someone we don't love, and grief exalts everyone we do love, dead or living, to where they belong, up in the sky. For however long we remember to hold them there together, despite their madness and limitations and clumsiness and bad timing and vulnerable points of integrity and unfair judgment that finds us wanting and beloved. So, on that light note, I thought maybe this would be a good time to have some conversation. Polly, are you there? And do we have any questions in the queue?
I'm here. And people are putting them in the chat, and that's totally fine. It might be a little easier if you all don't mind to put them in the Q&A so we can find them, but I'll go through the chat here. Mary Greer says hello.
Hi, Mrs. Greer. I can call you Mary on email, but not in person.
Richard Nuza, great stories from that trip, Mur. I remember it fondly. Mary Love reminds me of the poem "We Wear the Mask" by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Someone asked Is there any silver lining when we can't or won't listen to each other? Could the breakdown be precursor to something better?
I've been hoping that and saying that, hopefully, on this book tour. I do think that as far apart as we are and as sort of violently we've been arguing with each other, I'm hearing from people, people on very far parts of the spectrum have enjoyed this book. I'm talking very far parts, ends of the political spectrum and of the social spectrum. That gives me a lot of hope that I could write something that would be compelling and that people would actually connect with from all over the place. And I think the reason they're willing to even try, they're willing to even buy it, I think there's a grown factor with a thing like An Effort to Understand. It's like, oh, really, we're going to make an effort to understand each other. What's this really going to be? Is it going to be bland? Is it going to be a preachy thing? But I think the reason people get past that and buy this book is because we really are humbled by this. I think we're really scared. I think that a lot of us in this country realize we're in trouble and we really do have to try something. And we have to open our hearts a little bit. And I think that, not everybody, but I think most of us who are grown-ups and responsible citizens do feel scared and do feel a little cowed by this and humbled by it. And I think that we're willing to make an effort to understand. And I hope that we do make an effort. I hope that we listen with imagination to each other. That means not just finding somebody's argument idiotic, but trying to figure out where they came to this place, how they got to this point of view, listening between the lines, trying to understand the emotions that are driving some of these disagreements. And I think we need to listen with our hearts. And so I hope that this discord has scared some of us into realizing we got to do better than this. Yeah.
Somebody asked, tell us about the boots.
The boots. Those are the writing boots. My blog is called Writing Boots. You can see it at writing-boots.com. And the blog actually, these essays many of them are collected from the blog. I've been writing this blog since before Obama got elected. And the essays in here are from all of that time, talking about how we communicate with each other, not just politically, but at home and at work, in our communities. And the reason Writing Boots is called Writing Boots is William Carlos Williams said, no ideas, but in things, concrete. And I believe that writing is blue collar work in a way. It's arranging things. It's moving things around. It feels very real to me and very tactile. When I was in college, I think I thought, and after college, I think I thought what a writer did was tell the whole world all new ways to think. And then I got to about 30 and realized I didn't have that many new things to tell the world. And I didn't know how I wanted to tell the world to think, but I understood that I could tell stories better than other people, and and I could arrange words better than other people and make maybe old ideas seem new and fresh and hit people in a different way. And that all feels to me very tactile and very physical almost work. And so hence the boots. You need boots to be a good writer, I think. And a service truck. You should have a service truck, I think.
Okay. We have a few comments. As a former teacher, I always ask my students to, while demonstrating that they're listening, to ask the other person, what do you mean? How do you know? Feedback has told me it has served them well.
I think that makes all kinds of sense. I try to get better at that on these talks. Actually, I've been doing these for a couple months, and in the beginning, I felt like I had to be the answer person all the time, and I'm asking a lot of questions back to people. I had a young woman, a college student, asking me on a college book talk a month ago. She said, how much of an effort do you have to make to understand when she was a Mexican, and she said she married into a white family, and the white family basically, she's one of the dreamers, and the family's basically doesn't want her in the country. She's like, these are my in-laws, this is my husband's family, and they don't want me in the country. How am I supposed to make an effort to understand that? But I could tell by the way she was talking to me about it that she was really making an effort, and she was trying, and she wanted to. She understood that she didn't want to demonize these people. They were her husband's family. And so instead of like trying to answer her question, I actually asked her, well, you sound like you might be the expert. You've had to do it at holidays, and you've been figuring this out. How do you do it? And she then spoke for 5 minutes and said all these interesting things about how she goes about it, and how she gets tired, and how she takes a break. And we all kind of learned something about how she, actually tries to figure this out. And I just repeated a couple lines out of my book to cap her answer, and she gave a better answer than I did. And I felt great about that. And I'd love to use these book talks, to start conversations, not just to be a blowhard, which I can certainly do, as you can tell.
Lisa says, David, every time I hear you read the grief essay, I'm so grateful it exists in the world. So thank you for that again. How might we ask someone across differences to read your book and engage in conversation with us? How do we take a first step toward complicated conversations in this time of anger, fear, other emotions too?
Well, I think you play on this idea that I think that everybody on every side of the aisle, if they're even worth talking to, is upset about the place we're in, is horrified that we seem to live similar lives and come to such opposite and sort of unfixable or seeming unbridgeable conclusions from one another. So I think you can appeal to everybody and say, you're upset about this, right? Even though we're on the opposite side here, I'm upset about it too. And I read this book, and this book meant a lot to me, and I think it could mean a lot to you. And you give somebody the book as a gift. The book is a peace offering, and the person might receive it thinking, "Oh, this book's going to teach me what a jerk I am," right? And when they start reading the book, they won't feel that way. I didn't know this for sure when I published the book. But I'm telling you, people from so many different walks of life and so many different backgrounds have loved it, and it is truly a peace offering. So, giving the gift of the book, I wish people would buy this book 2 at a time, obviously for sales reasons, but because I have this maybe sentimental idea that we can create a great chorus by creating one good duet at a time, and I've got a few duets to work on in my own life. With some dear friends who are in different places, and it's been painful, and it takes time. One of the things that I talk about in the book is that these aren't magic arguments. We're not just gonna, nail the perfect zinger and turn other people around. We're not gonna do anything like that. These are ongoing conversations. I have a scene in the book where my dad had this girlfriend who he didn't get along with long after my mother died, and he didn't get along with Betty, and they would fight like hell all day long, and but they also were fond of each other. And one night I heard them going off into their separate bedrooms, and they were I heard my dad whisper into her bedroom, "We'll just try her again tomorrow, Betty." And that's what we have to do. We have to try and try and try. If we're patriots, if we believe in a country that can it all hang together, we have to try to keep communicating with each other. That's what we do in our marriages, and that's what we have to do in our lives. And I hope this book offers something that we can hold in common and have a discussion about across the aisle.
You just mentioned marriage, and it kind of goes right into this next question. What are you teaching your daughter about the effort to understand? How can parents have those difficult kinds of conversations?
Parents with kids, Is that you think?
Well, just what are you teaching your daughter, and how can parents have those conversations with their kids?
Yeah, well, one of the funny things about it is she listened to the book on tape, and she goes, yeah, Dad, I really already know all that stuff, which made me feel really good about it. But in terms of, having these conversations with kids, like one of the things that I do, we live in this Chicago bubble. My daughter and her friends, when they hear that somebody's a Trump supporter, it'd be like if you told me that, a member of the Third Reich you work with that person. You work with that person? Are they wearing their uniform? You're like, they can't even believe that these are people. Like, it's really something. And that freaks me out. I don't want that people to feel that way. So I take her on these back road trips around Illinois and around so that she goes to a Greasy Spoon and gets served by a Trump supporter and gets, Trump supporter calls her honey and officers, special, whipped cream up for her pancakes. I want her to understand that, there are people that have come to their places, the points of view as honestly or dishonestly as you have, probably. Everybody's come to their point of view from their life experience. And it doesn't mean that I just don't disagree vehemently with somebody else's point of view, but to demonize people, to treat people like they were born evil or something, or that's not what a responsible society is. And so I think parents have a responsibility, whichever side you're on, to introduce virtuous people from the other side. The picture the person who you disagree with most politically or ideologically in the world. That person lives a life very much like you do every day. That person does all the good things that you do every day. They get up out of bed when they don't want to. They make breakfast for their family. They go to a job that's sometimes fun and sometimes not. They're loyal. They work hard. They take care of their ailing parents. They do wonderful things for their friends. And you disagree with them politically, and that's important. And we have major important political disagreements in this country. But these are human beings who are doing heroic things every day just to be human beings. It's hard to be a person. And I think a lot of us do a wonderful job of being a person. And we look at our TV and we think it's a window. Your CNN TV is not a window. There's bad stuff's going on CNN, right? Your next door neighbor's, helping her daughter with her math homework. It's not as bad as you think, and people aren't as bad as you think. So I've poured that into her a lot, and that's hard sometimes because she's young and we're living in the era of Black Lives Matter. She's got a lot of righteous political ideas, and I don't mean self-righteous. I respect her idealism, and I respect the strong feelings that she has, and I come off sometimes as this bland guy who's trying to, make everybody get along, but I am not that person. I'm just somebody who is 52 years old, and I'm living in a country that I don't want to see. I don't want to see it getting, I want to see it survive. I want to see it survive as a place where we all belong. So I just talked to her about that stuff a lot, and I think all parents should.
How old's your daughter?
She's 17.
We have someone who comments, I feel like we are all in a group think bubble. If we dare to think independently or want to explore another view or talk with a person from, quote, the other political party, we're punished by our tribe. I want to understand and make the effort to understand, but I don't want to be thrown out of my tribe.
That's such a huge thing. And, one of my early conversations during this is I was talking to a podcast that's a prominent Republican speechwriter and a prominent Democratic speechwriter. And I about halfway through the show, I said, one of the things that I think is that liberals don't think about, especially right now, right after the election, right after January 6th, there are a lot of Trump people who are non-Trump Republicans who are having to tell their Trump relatives, this is where I get off, like, or they never liked Trump or whatever, but there's a huge split in the Republican Party with Trump. And I said, that is really got to be terribly painful. I mean, you are choosing between your tribe and your ideas, and if and I said to the conservative host, I said, Gene, you might know something about this. Your family, is all Trump people, and you're not. And she got choked up, like she couldn't talk for a minute. She's losing her family over this. Now, if liberal, and then meanwhile, all my liberal friends are out there on Facebook. Every Republican's a Trump person. Every Trump person's a creep. And I'm just like, what are you people doing? Like, you're being mean. You're not being empathetic. Tribes are gonna stick together, especially if they're being treated, pistol whipped by you. So, I think that just it's weird. I've been counseling leaders all this time as a speechwriter guy. My orientation is like, we need better leadership. But I've got a whole section in this book about how we need better followership. We need to be better citizens, each one of us. We need to stop being dismissive of each other. I think we do a lot of damage. We kind of downplay how much influence that we have on social media. You have 500 social friends on Facebook. Most people have 500 or more friends. You say something completely, all Trump voters are idiots or stuff like that, and on the other side, you're driving other Americans right into a bunker, and then you're going to say, "Hey, why is this country so divided?" It's partly divided because of you. Stop behaving this way.
Let's see. As a former Hudson School Board member, a former Hudson City Council member, and a former mayor of Hudson, I always found that the two strongest techniques to good mutual communications was, 1, focused listening, and 2, taking 100% of the responsibility that what you articulate is clearly understood. Do you agree?
I do agree with that. And the listening part takes so much discipline, because we are so often listening so that we can say something back. We're listening so that we can find something to leverage and win. You said one thing off, I'm going to take that and say, that's where you're wrong. Really listening is a discipline that we don't really have in this country. And it's something we have to cultivate in themselves. Taking complete responsibility for getting the idea across clearly to the other person. Yes, but that's where try her again tomorrow, Betty, comes into play, because we don't always get it right on the first time. It's hard to do. It's hard to get what's in my head into your head, partly because you're not, it's hard for you to listen because you've got all sorts of emotional baggage, and I can't just say that I'm articulate enough that I'm just going to transmit it. But it's me caring enough that if, I'm not, if I have to tell her one more time, yes, you do have to tell her one more time. I mean, what are your parents, what do you say about your parents or your mentors? You say, my mother always told me, not told me one, my mother once told me. No, she always said. And that's what we have to do. If we really believe something deeply, we have to always say it in different ways, in imaginative ways, and try to get it across if it's something we truly and deeply believe. I also think that we truly and deeply think we believe way more things than we truly and deeply believe. The word opinionated was a big word when I was growing up. It was my dad hated opinionated people. That was the worst person. So what was an opinionated person? I don't even think we know anymore, because it's not even really a word anymore. Why? Because we're all opinionated. You get to the end of a New York Times article about insurance policy in Asia, and it says, "What do you think?" Well, who cares what I think? I don't know anything about it. I think if you think about the political ideas that you truly have a stake in, that you truly they're either truly connected with your absolute identity, or there's something you actually happen to know something about. if you really think about it, you've got about 2 or 3 or 4 ideas there that you really can hold on to and claim that you're pretty sure you're absolutely right because you've really put in the time to know the issue. The rest of the stuff is default stuff. It's tribe stuff. It's like, well, I'm going to take their word for it. Have I studied environmental stuff? No, I haven't. I'm taking my tribe's basic point of view on it. I'm taking scientists. I've got my opinion, my suspicions about the funding of the scientists who go against it. But I have not studied that. I've not studied the voting laws in Georgia. I haven't studied that. I haven't compared them to the other voting laws. I just have this suspicion about it and some ideas about it, which is fine. That's fine. But you shouldn't then be willing to absolutely go to war on an issue that you haven't studied and that you don't have your own feeling about. So I think that, trying to figure out what are issues that are core to our soul and core to our intellect and really connected with us as human beings, trying to separate those from the other issues that we're pretty much kind of going on a hunch and going on a default. I think that's really important. And that's the part of the subtitle in the book where it says hearing each other and ourselves in a nation cracked in half. It's like, if you listen to yourself a little bit and really think about where you're really coming from, I think it helps in these conversations.
And I feel like this, you've probably talked about this a lot on your book tour, but I'm curious if, you have seen us more divided now, because you start the book as an anecdote in 1968.
Yeah.
More divided now than ever. And do you think that what's going on that has caused that? And I know, like, you've talked about the role of social media and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I argue with my sisters. I have 2 half sisters from my dad's first marriage who came of age then. And we actually have arguments. No, my time is worse. No, your time. The argument is open and it's constant. And we talk about it a lot. I think it depends on how you measure it. I mean, if you're talking about the width of the gap between somebody who's in QAnon and somebody who's in Antifa, that gap is pretty darn broad. But if you're talking about, I think that Nixon used to talk about the silent majority. I think there's a silent majority in this country of people who aren't really as far apart as they seem. So I don't know. I think I'm not terribly pessimistic, honestly, about this stuff. I'm upset about it. I'm scared about some of it. But I don't think it's the end. I think that I'm also excited by it. I must say that I have never felt as young. I haven't felt in 20 years as young as I feel now. I feel that, all the conversations about whether corporations are going to have a role in this conversation, all the conversations about how we're going to reorder society, I think they all ought to be had. I think it may be true that all this arguing that we're doing is a good thing. It's a good sign. We're exploring this stuff and it's nasty and it's upsetting and scary, but at least it's not, suppressed. I think that if this is a hard country to be a citizen in. It should be a hard country to be a citizen in. The founding fathers were at each other's throats from the get-go. And we had slavery, and we've had we brought immigrants in from every crazy corner of this earth, and we're trying to have a democracy here. Did you expect it was going to be easy and relaxing and we were all going to get along? Like, move to another country if that's if that's what you want. This is not the place for that. And so I think that we should also have energy for that and understand this is a hard country to be in. And I'm hearing all the time about how exhausted everybody feels. And we're exhausted from COVID, and we're exhausted from George Floyd, and we're exhausted from politics, and we're exhausted from all of this. And I think we need to take a week off and work on our core, because this is going to be hard. But let's work together. Come on.
I want to get to one last question. I was saving it for the last, but I have a couple quick questions. Someone did ask, where can I find a copy of Raised by Mad Men? Was a close friend of those two great people.
Oh,
I assume it's still in print.
it is. You can find it on Amazon. Raised by Mad Men by David Murray. Yeah, I'm curious as to who that was, but yeah.
I can say the name if they don't mind.
Oh, yeah.
Gwenver.
Oh, Genver Burnell. Genver Burnell from Kent. Hi, Genver. Nice to hear your name.
Okay, so I was obviously saving this one for last because I assume that this is Mary, your high school teacher.
Great.
Dave, I feel as if the humanities seem left behind in education these days, and what is taught is dumbed down. How many kids in high schools today are reading The Scarlet Letter or The Grapes of Wrath or Oedipus Rex or Moby Dick? All the things you're talking about, listening better, understanding questions that have no answers. These classic writers and poets are the original experts. Their work informs us all our lives. How does this contemporary void fill with these illuminating things? Any ideas on this curriculum lack? Hey, you can say no, so let's move on.
I'm kind of about to do that because I honestly don't know. I'm really frustrated with my daughter's the small amount of reading that she's had to do in high school. I can't even believe it.
Really?
And when The Great Gatsby came along, which is a book that, well, she's named after, her name is Scout. She's named after the main character in To Kill a Mockingbird. But that book I read to her, but when she was younger. But when Great Gatsby came up, and I was like, you are not reading the Cliff's Notes on this one. I am going to read this book to you. I'm going to deliver this book personally to you in your head, chapter by chapter. And because that, I agree with everything Mary said, and I think that's what makes life interesting to me. And I honestly do not know how to fix that.
Excellent. You said you had, before we go out, you had a passage you wanted to share.
Yes, I'd like to read one last. It keeps getting darker in here. I hope I can. I do have one passage that's that sort of caps the book a little bit. It's the sort of the end of the book, actually. Half a century ago, when Bobby Kennedy spoke about how we need to make an effort in this country, he was talking about making an effort to understand other people, the people we work for, the people who work for us, our political leaders, our colleagues, our family, our friends, and our fellow citizens of all kinds of backgrounds, at a moment of great national discord and disunity, mere hours after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Speaking publicly for the first time about his own brother's assassination less than 5 years earlier, he addressed an audience that he acknowledged might be tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust. And he said, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand or go beyond these rather difficult times. And in an all-black, poor neighborhood in North Indianapolis, Kennedy didn't pander to his audience by reading them some Langston Hughes poem, or even by reciting a line from Martin Luther King Jr. Rather, he spoke of the inspiration he found reading Greek poetry in the dark years after his brother's death. He spoke from his own heart and trusted it would reach the hearts of others. My favorite poet was Aeschylus, and he once wrote, and here Kennedy pauses for 5 seconds, so long it begins to seem as if he has forgotten the words, but he has not. In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. And in concluding, Kennedy borrowed once more from the ancients. Let us dedicate ourselves, he pleaded, to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that.
David, that was fabulous. Thank you so much for being here, even though you can't be in Hudson. If
I
you
feel
ever,
like I'm there.
if you ever are
feels
in
right here like
Hudson,
I'm there.
I know. If you're ever in Hudson, please stop by the library to say hello. I just want to say a lot of people and have just very great comments. Ed says, outstanding, eye-opening, we can do it presentation. And Mary, I hope you don't mind if I share this because I think Dave would really like this, and I don't know if he'll be able to see it. Dave, you've grown up to be the awesome guy I suspected you were and would become even more. Great interview, lots of love, and more later. So what a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us, everybody, and David. Pleasure to meet you.
So nice to meet you. Yeah.
And don't forget, the book is available for purchase from the Learned Owl bookstore. The link is in the chat, or you can just call up the Learned Owl and they'll get that book for you. Good night, everyone.